enter. Welcome, everyone. We'll start in just a few minutes as people join us. Okay, it's just 2:58, so I'll wait a few more minutes and we'll start right at 3 o'clock.
Hi, Deb. How are you? Hi,
Good. Rami, how are you? Thanks for joining us. We're just
No
about
worries.
to start. I'm waiting just
Very
until 3 p.m. Okay, I think we can start. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Deborah Tollefson, and I'm a professor of philosophy here at the University of Memphis, and I'm director of the Technology Serving Humanity Speaker Series. This is a new public lecture series launched by the U of M FedEx Institute of Technology. It focuses on the social, political, legal, ethical, and philosophical aspects of technology with the aim of broadening our understanding of technology's vast impacts. National and international scholars from the humanities, fine arts and communication, the social sciences, and other areas will be joining us or have joined us this year. You can find out more about this series at the FedEx Institute of Technology website. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. S. Craig Watkins. He is the Ernest A. Sharp Centennial Professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Watkins is the author of 6 books and numerous articles exploring young people's engagement with media and technology. His 2 most recent books, The Digital Edge and Don't Knock the Hustle, results from his work with the Connected Learning Research Network, a research collaborative funded by the MacArthur Foundation. Dr. Watkins is the founding director of the Institute for Media Innovation, a new boutique hub for research and design located in the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas. He is also the director of UT's Good Systems Racial Justice Research Focus Area, RFA. The RFA brings together researchers, industry, and other stakeholders to explore ways that algorithmic fairness can be built into the automated decision-making systems that allocate critical resources and services to citizens and consumers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Watkins.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Deborah, for the generous introduction. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So first of all, I'm glad to hear that, that this series is underway this year. As I'm sure many of you know, the increasing presence and role of technology, big data, artificial intelligence, that all of these systems are playing ever more increasing and important roles in society, and are shaping our lives in both small and quite significant ways. And so I'm sure that this series has been an opportunity for you to learn about and engage researchers across a range of different disciplines who are trying to probe these developments with a very discerning eye in hopes of generating more knowledge and awareness of the increasing sort of high stakes that are associated with these systems. So I'm going to talk to you today about some work that I'm doing both at University of Texas, and I'm also spending this year as a visiting professor at MIT, working with a couple of teams and a broader sort of MIT initiative related to understanding artificial intelligence in relationship to systemic racism. And I'll talk a bit about that as well. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, so hopefully you see my screen. And let me start with a sort of an example of why this issue, artificial intelligence, and its relationship to concerns about racial equity and racial justice are growing increasing momentum and interest in this country and certainly around the world. Some of you may be familiar with this particular story that was reported by ProPublica, I think back in 2015 or 2016. And it was one of the first in terms of like public journalism, one of the first attempts to sort of systematically examine the ways in which AI-based systems were being incorporated in society and in ways that were highly problematic. Here, more specifically, ProPublica was looking at what we might call risk assessment algorithms. That is to say, algorithms that try to make a determination about whether or not someone is likely to be a repeat offender, to commit a crime, if they were to be released by a judge, for example. And what ProPublica found, sort of looking at a piece of very popular software, Compass, I think was the name of the software, that was being used by a growing number of judges and municipalities around the country, that there were these sort of biased results that were emerging, where the algorithm, was making predictions that were turning out to be sort of wrong or inconsistent. So for example, Blacks were much more likely, even when they had less of a criminal record, were much more likely to be evaluated by the algorithm as a higher risk than their white counterpart who had committed more egregious or violent crimes or a greater frequency of crimes. And what ProPublica and many others were essentially arguing is that as these systems, automated decision-making systems, AI-based systems, are being more fully integrated into these sort of high-stakes settings or high-stakes scenarios, in this case, the criminal justice system. We're seeing these systems being adopted in healthcare, in employment, in policing, in a whole range of, again, areas and domains of life that have considerable high stakes. And what should we as a society understand and be aware of as these kinds of systems are being adopted to make these kinds of choices about policing, choices about criminal justice, choices about the delivery of healthcare, choices about employment and hiring, for example. And so this was, in some respects, one of a number of different calls, if you will, to say, hey, wait a minute, what's the role of humans, when it comes to monitoring these systems? What's the role of humans when it comes to overruling these systems? So should a judge simply basically make a decision that an algorithm has presented to him or her. And of course, what we've come to understand, since this piece was reported, and even before then, that humans, in fact, must be in the loop. And in fact, humans must, in some ways, control the process rather than the machines or the algorithmic processes controlling humans and human decision making. And I mention that, right, because that was 2015, 2016. And in 2019 and 2020, the New York Times reported, among other outlets as well, of incidents where African-American men had been erroneously identified by facial recognition software and accused and arrested for crimes that they had not committed. And it again sort of raised this this air of suspicion, of concern, of critique, of suggesting, right, that these systems were being deployed in ways that simply weren't reliable, were being deployed in ways that were replicating historical forms of biases and racism. And so, even as we have come to understand that these systems are in some ways sort of fundamentally flawed in many respects, they're still being used and still being deployed in ways that lead to these kinds of disparate impacts and disparate outcomes. And again, we're seeing this, right, in a range of other sectors as well. So there's a whole growing body of literature that attempts to sort of document the ways in which computational systems, algorithmic models, for example, are contributing to and in some ways even scaling and accelerating the kinds of legacy biases and forms of racism that have long been a part of our nation's history. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Sophia Noble, for example, in terms of her examination of algorithmic discrimination. But researchers have also looked at the ways in which racial bias sort of creeps into online advertisements, or the ways in which it shapes predictive policing kinds of operations. We've given an example of criminal justice. And so there's a growing recognition that these systems are failing us in ways that require creativity, that require innovation, that require intervention in terms of trying to mitigate the kinds of disparate impacts associated with these systems. One of the more interesting ways in which those on the technology side, let's say some of the technology practitioners, those who actually build these models, machine learning models, for example, there's been a growing movement, if you will, within that community and beyond around ethical issues and around what we might call fairness in machine learning or fairness in artificial intelligence. And if you read the literature, what you'll see is that there's no one definition of machine learning or artificial intelligence fairness. There's no standard process, if you will, for understanding what fairness means and then trying to build that in your models, to build that in your system. And in fact, right, there are any number of different definitions, competing definitions, if you will, of fairness. And here are just some examples. In some cases, right, fairness is described primarily along what we might call sort of this notion of parity metrics, where if an algorithm is producing similar outputs, right, for Blacks, for whites, for men, for women, et cetera, then that would be considered fair. In some cases, right, you have those who advocate that a fair algorithmic system should be race neutral. In other words, right, that it should be designed, developed, written in a way in which race is somehow rendered neutral, race is somehow rendered absent in the composition and development of the algorithm itself. Now, many would argue, right, that in some ways is a naive and even problematic approach to trying to understand, fairness in machine learning, because while you may not explicitly acknowledge race under that particular construct or notion of fairness, that race creeps in other ways, right? So that race oftentimes, stands in, there are other proxy variables, right, that might be associated with race: education, income, poverty, geography, zip code, things of this sort. So even when a system, right, is designed to be unaware of race or race neutral, in many respects, right, it is still likely operating under certain racialized assumptions that are simply unavoidable just by virtue of the nature of the society in which we live in. And then there's some who go on the other end of the spectrum, what we might call algorithmic affirmative action, where you design models, right, that try to compensate for racial inequality. So in this sense, trying to design systems that are very much race conscious, race aware, and those sort of approximate, some of the kinds of things that we've seen, for example, in the case of affirmative action based policies. But the point here, right, is that there's an expansive list and definitions of fairness in machine learning, fairness in algorithm and artificial intelligence. And so these are debates that are still ongoing and that researchers are still trying to contend with, as well as technology practitioners as well. There's a growing body of research in terms of how those within the industry are trying to address this issue of fairness. And I'll focus on one in particular, right? But I think that there are many different moments within the life cycle of the design of an artificial intelligence system or model. Everything right from problem formulation to data collection and processing, building that model, and then of course deploying and monitoring that model, that you could argue, right, that as you begin to think about issues of fairness, and as I'll talk about here in a moment, as you begin to think about issues of justice and issues of equity, that along each of those different moments in the life cycle, that there are likely instances, circumstances, ways of intervening to try to mitigate or to reduce the potential impact of bias and discrimination, in your models, and more importantly, in terms of the outputs and sort of recommendations and analytics that these models then generate. But one area, right, that developers have focused on specifically, and many others as well, is trying to think more critically about the kinds of data sets that drive these systems. And of course, we all know that these systems are essentially predicated on the sort of massive accumulation of data that allow machines, right, to begin to start processing data, understanding data, identifying patterns in data, and then learning from those patterns and making recommendations, making decisions, and sort of modifying itself even as it proceeds and moves along in terms of its operational capacity. And what a lot of practitioners are suggesting is the need, for example, to create data sets that are simply more representative of the population. So this is one of the problems, right? I mentioned, some of the faulty, errors associated and that have been identified with facial recognition software. One of the primary reasons, right, that those systems are unreliable when it comes to identifying people with darker skin tone, identifying women compared to men, for example, is the sort of data sets in which those systems have been tested. More likely, right, the lack of representation of people of color, the lack of representation of women, therefore the higher rates of error when it comes to trying to identify, those segments of the population. And so the argument, right, is how do you begin to create, right, a mechanism, a process for ensuring that your data, right, is not inherently biased? Because if that data is inherently biased, the sort of belief is that it then leads to an inherently biased model and inherently biased outcomes, right, that are a result of that data. And so there's a whole sort of conversation, a whole set of practices that are now beginning to emerge around trying to build more robust data sets that are audited, that are tested, and therefore assessed for potential expressions and forms of bias. One of the interesting sort of challenges that I think those in the practitioner community are having to contend with is developing a more sophisticated understanding of how we might think about racial bias, for example. And what I want to argue here, right, is that as understandable as the fairness debate is, this emphasis on fairness, that in some ways, that may not be a sufficient enough of a framing of this problem to really advance us towards developing systems that address these kinds of disparate impacts in a more concrete and valuable way. So what I want to share with you here, right, is there's a long body of social scientific literature, sociologists, for example, political scientists, who have studied racism and really sort of developed different notions of racism. So we might think of racism along a spectrum, if you will. On one end of that spectrum, you see here is what we might call interpersonal racism. This is person-to-person racism, for example, using a racial epithet, perhaps assaulting someone, right, in a way that's racially motivated. And the idea, right, is that those are more person-to-person, more individualized expressions or forms of racism. Not insignificant, but a particular, again, form or expression of racism itself. In the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, we began to develop this notion, this concept of institutionalized racism. And that was an attempt to sort of understand the ways in which specific institutions, the educational system or institutions, the criminal justice system as an institution, housing as an institution, the occupational sector as an institution, the ways in which these institutions began to develop certain norms, certain practices, certain behaviors, certain customs that advantage some groups and disadvantage other groups, and how those practices are sort of institutionalized, that is to say, baked into the very fabric of how those different organizations and institutions function and operate. And then there's this notion of structural racism, which has received a lot of attention over the last 2 to 3 years, most notably, right, as a response to the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, a recognition, right, that there's something more systematic, there's something more structural or systemic that's happening that's very different, right, than that person-to-person racism or even institutionalized racism, that there's this broader sort of structure, if you will, structural conditions and structural processes that we must also understand. And I mention this, right, because I think the fairness in artificial intelligence debate, the fairness in machine learning debate tends to focus primarily on designing algorithms that address what we might call interpersonal or individualized forms of racism. And I think the challenge for us, right, is to sort of think about how these computational systems can be designed in ways that address the structural aspects of racism, which is obviously, right, a much more complex, a much more difficult, a much more daunting challenge, but one that I think we necessarily need to address. And let me give you just another example of what I mean by this. So this is from sociologist Barbara Reskin, who's written a lot about structural racism, or what she calls systems of discrimination or discriminating systems. And here, for instance, we see different sort of domains or subsystems, right, that make up, the larger society, if you will: credit markets, housing, school segregation, criminal justice system, health. And each of these different subsystems, each of these domains, right, have their own history, have their own mode of operation, their own institutions, and that in some ways sort of reproduce different kinds of inequality: gender inequality, class inequality, racial and ethnic inequality. But what becomes really interesting, right, in terms of this structural dynamic is how we understand the sort of interlocking nature of these subsystems or these domains. That is to say, how occurrences in one or conditions in one are connected to and in some ways impact and trigger conditions in other subsystems or other domains. And it's this sort of connected nature, right, of these different subsystems and domains that make up this larger kind of structural dynamic that becomes, I think, really, really problematic. And so part of what Reskin argues, right, is that we can think of this sort of racial discrimination system if 3 conditions are met. First condition, right, is that there are disparities, racial disparities exist in every subsystem. And we know, right, as a result of decades of research, right, that there's a whole body of literature of racial discrimination in the credit markets, in the employment sector, in education, in health, for example. And so we know that there's empirical evidence, right, that these forms of racial disadvantage, racial inequality exist and persist, right, and have persisted for some time now. And that these disparities, right, have to at least be partly, if not entirely, the result of discrimination. And again, we know that the body of literature supports that. And again, I think this is the key point, right, that there's this reciprocity, right, that disparity in one is linked to disparity in another. And I'll give you an example here in a moment in terms of what I mean by this. But as you can see, right, the kind of challenge, the computational challenge is, how do we begin to design algorithms and systems and models that attend to these sort of structural dynamics? And that's a very different kind of challenge. And as I noted earlier, I think most of the fairness in artificial intelligence, most of the fairness in machine learning conversation, the ways in which practitioners understand this problem, the ways in which they're trying to develop models and computational systems to address this problem, tend to sort of, I think, exist primarily along the sort of interpersonal or person-to-person understanding of racism, sort of individualized expressions of forms of racism. And so you want an algorithm, right, that treats people who are alike to treat them alike, right, to treat them similarly. And what I'm suggesting, right, is how we begin to sort of move along this continuum and begin to design models, right, that are not only intended to be fair, right, but are also intended to be equitable and to practice justice. And that's a very different bar. And that's a very different set of challenges that I'm beginning to sort of think more and more about in my work and sort of my engagement with those who build these systems or think about these systems. How do we begin to sort of facilitate that conversation? And let me give you some examples of how some of the work that I'm doing and work that I've become familiar with is trying to sort of move, if you will, the efforts and the kind of computational work that we do sort of in that direction. So I'll talk about good systems, which is a grand challenge at the University of Texas at Austin. Basically, good systems is a reference to what we oftentimes hear as ethical or responsible artificial intelligence. And I also want to talk about some work that I've been doing this year with some of my colleagues at MIT at the Institute for Data Systems and Society, which is part of a larger initiative that IDSS has developed that's very much related to some of the issues or many of the issues that I've described here to you to this point. So basically, what MIT has done is launched an initiative on combating systemic racism. And what they're trying to do is to bring together the sort of interdisciplinary, sort of multidisciplinary teams to look at the ways in which computational models and computational systems can be configured, can be designed, developed in ways that address some of these more systemic or structural forms of racism that I was alluding to earlier. This initiative is being sort of coordinated and led by Patini Christia, who's a researcher and a professor at MIT, and she's supported by the director of IDSS, Munzer Dali. So at MIT right now, with this initiative, they're sort of thinking about this through different verticals. And these are the first 4 verticals that they've launched with this initiative. There's a team looking at AI and policing. There's a team looking at the role of AI in health, housing, and then also social media. And the 2 that I've been most principally involved with are the policing and the housing verticals. And the questions that are emerging across each of these verticals, right, is the use of predictive analytics to understand domain-specific practices. So that is to say, understanding specific practices in policing and public safety, understanding specific practices within the healthcare sector. And they're looking at, have specific projects where they're trying to address some of these questions more broadly speaking. But the idea, right, is can you design computer models to better understand, right, the ways in which disparities, inequality, biases, and discriminatory patterns take shape and persist across these different verticals, across these different domains. I want to make a point here that I think is very important, or at least it's important to me, that I think what I've explained up to this point suggests that this is, in some respects, right, trying to design computational models that attend to some of these structural inequalities is a computational challenge or a technical challenge, and it certainly is, right? It's about data curation, for example. How do you contextualize your data? How do you build data sets, again, that are more representative? The modeling work that you do. Those are all certainly technical dilemmas or technical challenges, but I also think, right, that there are important social challenges as well, right, that we must be mindful of. In other words, right, these are not problems that machines or computational models will solve on their own, and that humans must in fact be or play a significant role in terms of whatever effort or whatever initiatives are developed as a way to try to mitigate and to reduce bias and disparate impacts in these systems. And so I'll give some examples of that here in a moment. Let me talk just about one of the verticals at MIT, which is the housing vertical, and why MIT and my colleagues elected to pursue this as one of the many different domains that they're trying to bring this kind of critical perspective to in terms of understanding this issue and trying to develop new ways of thinking, new paradigms, new approaches, new models for addressing this work. Homeownership, right, is important for a variety of reasons, but perhaps arguably, right, the most significant reason is that home ownership in the United States is the primary path to wealth accumulation in the society. In other words, right, if you look at wealth accumulation, home ownership, right, is strongly correlated, right, to the ability to accumulate, generate, and even pass on wealth across generations. The work of Melvin Oliver and Thomas Shapiro years ago, two social scientists, did some pretty extensive analyses of what we now call the racial wealth gap. And part of what they understood there, right, is that the assets, for example, that whites have access to are quite different from the assets that African Americans have access to. Whites have access to not only assets related to their home, but stocks, investments, inheritance, a range of assets, right, that help to sort of build their wealth and sustain that wealth across generations. What they found is for African Americans, the overwhelming majority of their wealth was linked to home ownership, right? That they didn't have that sort of diverse set of assets or portfolios that could sort of expand their capacity for wealth generation. And this becomes important, right? Because if in the case of African Americans, if wealth is linked almost exclusively to home ownership, and we know, right, that there have been historical challenges in terms of racial equality in the home ownership marketplace, then this, right, has a significant impact on what we talk about now as the racial wealth gap in society. And so part of the role of this particular vertical is understanding that history and understanding the sort of economic and social significance that home ownership plays in the accumulation of wealth in the society. And so there are a host of other developments that are sort of required to understand here, thinking about just racial disparities in lending practices. And what a lot of the early research from the team at MIT began to discover is that the primary problem, right, in terms of home ownership, right, and Blacks disproportionately being more likely to be rejected for home mortgage loans, being rejected for getting access to resources that might allow them to pursue home ownership. The main problem, right, is debt to income ratio, that African Americans tend to have a higher debt to income ratio than their white counterparts, therefore making them a higher risk, if you will, for a home mortgage loan. And so the question becomes, right, so sort of structurally what's going on there, right? So that's the problem. But what are the structural dynamics, right, that lead to that problem? And that's something, right, that the team has had to explore. So home ownership, right, is linked to credit markets, which are linked, right, to a whole set of other kinds of institutions and practices that together conspire to create this sort of structural dynamic that limits the capacity for African Americans to gain access to the resources and to the assets that lead to home ownership, that lead to wealth accumulation, that lead to sustained wealth across generations, and therefore sort of leading to this widening sort of racial wealth gap, if you will. Let me bring you back, right, to this model that I showed you earlier. And what you see here, right, is the extent to which housing and mortgage, right, are sort of a key sort of critical component in this broader sort of system of discrimination that we see here. You begin to see, right, that housing is connected to so many other subsystems here. It's connected to residential segregation, which means that it's connected to school segregation, connected to educational access, connected to the criminal justice system, connected to health disparities and outcomes. And so the question becomes, how do you begin to sort of think about the ways in which computational models might begin to address that? And part of what I want to argue here again is something that I noted earlier, is that this isn't just a technical or computational challenge, but it's a social challenge, it's a policy challenge, it's a broad challenge that encompasses a wide range of skills. And so, my engagement with colleagues at MIT this year suggests, right, that there's some really interesting initial takeaways from this initiative on combating systemic racism that has been, implemented here. So there are, for example, what we might call some structural insights in terms of, designing, models, designing systems that try to facilitate a more nuanced understanding of the ways in which these subsystems are interlocked and connected to each other. And, interesting conversation that we've been having is, could you begin to design models that help you to understand, are there specific domains in that broader system of domains that I shared with you earlier? Are there some that are more influential than others? In other words, right, are there some that if you could impact them in a meaningful way, that it then might have a triggering effect or a cascade effect across the entire system, therefore beginning to address these sort of structural inequities in a much more effective and impactful way. And then finally, right, again, thinking about these as not only technical systems, but social systems as well. So a number of social scientists, myself included, like to think of artificial intelligence, machine learning, these computer-based systems as socio-technical systems. In other words, right, that the social aspect, right, has to do with the values that we bring to the development of these systems, the deployment of these systems, how we use these systems, and the ways in which they interact, right, with these historical forms of bias and disparate impacts and outcomes that are a marker of society, more broadly speaking. But how can these models inform, right, policy? How can they inform, right, how federal, state, and local officials and governments, spend, their funds and their resources, and how might it impact, legislation even? And so these are, I think, sort of critical takeaways from the MIT work that I've come to understand and really appreciate. And let me end by talking just a little bit about the Good Systems work at University of Texas at Austin. So Good Systems is one of 3 grand challenges that the Office of Vice President for Research has launched over the last few years or so. The first 2, one was around sort of health and wellness. The second one was around climate and sustainability issues. And then the third one was around good systems, or again, what we might refer to as ethical or responsible artificial intelligence. Again, this is a conversation that is becoming global in scope. So if you followed, for example, a lot of the conversation and even in policy recommendations in Europe, the European Union, they are in some respects miles ahead of us in terms of how they're understanding the significance or the urgency of these systems and the need to put in place regulatory mechanisms, to build a regulatory apparatus that tries to assert some degree of control over these systems in terms of how they function and operate, how data is collected and deployed by those who use these systems, the degree to which people should have certain rights when it comes to how these systems make decisions. To give you one example, if I'm someone who has been rejected by an algorithm for a home loan, or I'm someone who's been rejected by an algorithm for a job, or an algorithm has said that I'm a high risk and therefore a judge should not allow me to go back out into society, that decision and how that decision was rendered should be made transparent and explainable to me. And so there's now a whole sort of movement to say that these systems must be accountable, they must be transparent, they must be able to explain, right, how these sort of high stakes, life impacting decisions are being made. And so this is part of what Good Systems is trying to do, like so many other efforts and initiatives, is to essentially bring together a sort of multidisciplinary team of researchers to explore these issues. If Good Systems was launched at UT or anywhere else, 10 years ago, the likelihood, right, is that it would have primarily been computer scientists, engineers, and maybe data scientists. Today, right, it includes those experts, but it also includes social scientists. It also includes philosophers. It also includes designers and artists. This idea, right, that you need a range of expertise and perspectives and understandings to really be able to develop, right, an understanding of the complexity of these systems and what's at stake for society as a whole. And this is something that we're doing at Good Systems. More specifically, the project that I'm working on at Good Systems and helping to lead is around artificial intelligence and the future of racial justice. And it's myself and some other colleagues and graduate students who are trying to launch a number of different projects that are intended, right, to sort of better understand how we might develop AI in ways that support racial equity and racial justice. This is work that's being led by Chandra Bhatt, professor of engineering at the University of Texas at Austin, who has significant expertise in transportation and has been thinking more recently in his work, and he and his graduate students, about the sort of racial and equity implications associated with transportation. And if you think about it, right, transportation is a significant resource, is a significant service, that we as citizens have access to or should have access to, because it impacts everything. How do we get to and from work? How do we get to and from school? How do we get to and from other sort of critical places that we need to access in order to live and sustain our lives? What Chandra and his team have done is collected some transportation data here from the city of Houston. And these red dots are sort of indicators of traffic injuries and fatalities in the greater city of Houston. And this is from data from 2012 to 2021. And what they and I'll just give you like this sort of a couple of the quick top line sort of takeaways here. But what they found is that although African Americans make up about 17% of the population in Houston, they represent about 28% of the fatal and sustained injuries, right? Pedestrian-related fatalities and sustained injuries, suggesting, right, that Blacks are disproportionately more likely to be victims of fatalities for car crashes or traffic accidents, for example, compared to their white counterparts. And so one of the questions is, how do we understand this, right? And what are the conditions that sort of speak to that? And in some respects, right, they're trying to understand the broader kind of structural conditions that lead to those kinds of disproportionate or disparate outcomes in terms of pedestrian fatalities. One thing they're looking at, right, is just exposure, for example, right? So to what extent are Blacks more likely to own cars? And therefore, if they're less likely to own cars, more likely to be pedestrians, more likely to be trying to access public transportation, they're therefore more likely going to be exposed to potential, car crashes and traffic accidents. And so looking at everything from car ownership to miles traveled to population density. And so this becomes, one way of trying to understand this through a database lens, if you will. They also think about the built environment, and that is to say the degree to which Black neighborhoods and communities are built and designed in ways that, again, make them more vulnerable to being victims of car, traffic incidents and fatalities, traffic signals, intersections in road density, the number of lanes, right, in a community, the length of sidewalks and things of this nature. And what they found, right, is that African Americans are much more likely to live in communities or live in neighborhoods, built environments, right, that subject them to a higher probability of being exposed to these kinds of traffic incidents. And so part of what they want to do, right, is to take this data and begin to start building computational models that try to sort of provide some predictive analytics that might help, right, transportation authorities, that might help policymakers and others begin to understand, what interventions can we develop? What interventions can we make to mitigate and reduce this risk, right? This sort of disparate impact that we're seeing in terms of the ways in which certain populations are rendered more vulnerable to traffic accidents in a way that leads to higher rates of fatality, higher rates of injury, and things of that nature. And so the point here, as I was mentioning earlier, is the models, I think, become a pathway to generating greater insight, greater precision and understanding that ultimately, right, must then be translated in terms of policy, translated in terms of how do we build communities and how do we build environments and how do we mobilize resources to address these things that our data and that our computational models were able to sort of provide for us in terms of better understanding, more precise understanding. And this is something that I think is becoming increasingly important. And then one other project that I'll mention is some work that I've been doing kind of in the health space. So right as the pandemic began in this country, right, as it began to start spreading February and March of 2020, the CDC began collecting a range of data, including data on mental health. And they began to start collecting data pretty regularly, throughout the first several months of the pandemic, the first year and a half, I think, or so. They were collecting this data pretty consistently over that span of time. And what they found, right, is that while we were all certainly, vulnerable to COVID-19, in some ways, right, I think we were all sort of grappling not only with the sort of physical and sort of medical risk, but also, right, the impact in terms of our own mental state and mental well-being. But what a lot of the early research suggested, right, is that young adults, people of color, and essential workers were dealing with particular issues around behavioral health, mental health, substance abuse, and things of this sort. Much more likely to report, concerns around depression and anxiety. Much more likely to report substance use, increased substance use during the pandemic. Much more likely to report, suicidal ideation, that is to say, thoughts about suicide. And this is in some ways consistent with patterns and trends that have been evolving. That is to say, rising rates of mental health conditions in this country, rising rates of mental health condition amongst younger populations and amongst younger populations of color, more specifically. And we know that historically, right, there have been any number of factors that have created these barriers to lower income communities, people of color, for example, getting access to the kinds of health services and resources that might help them better manage, right, some of these disparate health outcomes. Stigma, lack of knowledge and understanding, and also thinking about, right, the sort of financial barriers, right, that limit people's access to care. And I started really before the pandemic, but I started thinking about, could you begin to start designing, computational models? Could you build a system that in some ways was designed in such a way as to help populations that have historically been sort of rendered on the margins of care, begin to design systems that in some ways, right, could facilitate greater access to care, providing access to care via computational models, via a digital health platform, for example, that might give them access to information, that might give them access to expertise, that might give them access to healthcare providers, despite some of these barriers that have traditionally limited their access to care. And so this is something, that we've been thinking about in my own work, for example. This is just to give you a sense of, we're also thinking about how the models that we create, actually a product and a platform that we're trying to build, how it might support healthcare workers in their capacity to better serve, right, this rising, population of people who are looking for different kinds of health services in the mental and behavioral health space, as well as chronic conditions, illnesses, and things of that nature. I just want to share this with you. This is an interesting set of data points from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And what it's doing is sort of projecting the sort of change in trends in employment, over the last 2 decades or so. And what we see here, right, is that healthcare employees, the rate of growth for healthcare employees has exceeded that of non-healthcare related employees by a significant margin, right? The rate at which it's growing is quite significant and quite striking compared to the overall sort of general workforce, and more broadly speaking. If you look at the numbers even further, right, in terms of projecting between 2010, 2020, and 2030, for example, the number of what we might call behavioral health specialists, social workers, mental health professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, peer specialists, the rate of growth of those segments of the healthcare occupation are expected to grow by something like 23%, compared to about a 7% increase amongst the overall occupational workforce, suggesting, right, increasing demand for those services and the need to provide, if you will, a greater number of employees to sort of meet that demand. And part of what we're trying to think about, right, is how can you begin to start designing systems that are responsive to these conditions, that are designed in ways, right, that address some of these equity gaps, and that provide like a resource and a tool for healthcare workers and the patients that they're working with, or the clients that they're working with, to deal more effectively with behavioral health conditions. And I want to suggest that, as we begin to sort of develop this project further, to build out, a prototype product that we, want to test in the real world, that there are certainly technical challenges, right, in terms of, the kinds of data sets that we create and build. Thinking about social data, behavioral data, environmental data. There's even sort of, biometric data that might go into a system as well, that might help models become much more effective in terms of trying to predict certain outcomes, therefore providing certain recommendations or certain alerts that might allow you to perhaps engage in more preventative measures, right, at some point in time. But I also think, right, that this is a social challenge as well, because we know that historically, right, that systemic racism has existed in the behavioral health sector, in the healthcare sector, more broadly speaking. And so how are we sort of thinking about, those kinds of, developments, those kinds of practices, those social challenges that have in some ways diminished people's trust in the healthcare system, in some ways diminish their access to these services. And therefore, again, as I've noted earlier, I see this work that we're trying to do as presenting both technical and social challenges. And then let me end just with two other sort of comments, if I can. When I think about the future of computational systems, we're doing a fairly adequate job of beginning to think more critically about, well, who builds these systems, right? And so if you think about, a growing call for a greater diversity, right, amongst those who develop these systems, computer scientists, engineers, data scientists, as we bring more social scientists, more ethicists, more designers into the system, this idea, right, that we need to create a pipeline, right, where we're bringing in a greater diversity of talent that might then sort of influence, right, how these systems are being made. But I also think another important point that we haven't spent as much time on is who deploys artificial intelligence, right? Who are the managers? Who are the decision makers, right? Who choose systems, who say that these are models, these are systems that we're going to use. These systems are going to, in some ways, drive our operations. They're going to impact and influence the decisions that we make, the resources, how we allocate them. And this is a question really around what we might call AI literacy, and then how we think about future workforce development as it relates to AI and machine learning. And I think that is a significant challenge, right? So it's not only about who's building these systems, right? But again, who's deploying these systems, who's actually applying these systems in the real world, and to what extent are they thinking about these ethical, equitable, and justice implications that I've noted here throughout the talk. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions or just your thoughts and reflections on anything that I've shared here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Watkins. We have time for questions. If you would use the Q&A function, that's an easy way for me to track the questions. I'll keep a lookout on the chat as well, just in case. Okay, the first question regarding socio-technical systems, a different way one might use these AI algorithms is in uncovering biased, unfair systems, reverse the inference. The traffic example seemed one of these. Basically, feed or build algorithms with the data from an existing system that one suspects has built-in biases, and see whether the fairness variable, for instance, race, is significant by itself, all other things in the model being accounted for. In a sense, it is detecting that bias is a factor in determining outcomes, over and above more legitimate variables. By taking the bias indicating variable out, the algorithm is less predictive, which means the system was biased. Is there work like this going on?
Absolutely, that's a great observation, and I think a number of important points are made in that question. And that's precisely the work that Chandra and his team are attempting to do. In other words, they're already doing some modeling and some statistical work to try to do precisely that. That if you could account right for all other variables, right? What else would explain, right, these disparate impacts? And at least what they're coming up to understanding in some of the preliminary work that they've done, preliminary analysis that they've conducted, is that race and racial bias, right, tends to still be a pretty significant factor. And so for them, once you account for built environment, once you account for economics, once you account for some of these other variables, race still appears to be quite salient. And again, the work is still fairly early, right, in terms of its execution. But their belief, right, is that their work thus far is suggesting that there's something specific about the racial component or the racial dynamic that that speaks to the kinds of statistical outcomes that they're seeing in the data that they're looking at.
Thank you. Any other questions for our speaker?
And I didn't talk about it, right? But one of the things that we're also doing with the Good Systems work is we've been having some engagements with the city of Austin. We've had a number of meetings with one of the city's assistant city managers who oversees public safety operations and departments, fire, police, emergency medical services, for example. We've had some conversations with them about trying to create a mechanism or a process through which they can begin to become more strategic in terms of understanding some of the challenges associated, with these systems. I mentioned predictive policing earlier, but we know that that the ways in which police departments currently are adopting and deploying these systems, have some pretty serious limitations that are leading to the exacerbation of some of these sort of biased outcomes. We've also been, had meetings with public health, with transportation, with housing, with a number of other different departments. But the key there, right, is beginning to try to help cities think about, as they start adopting these systems, integrating them into their operations with a greater degree of regularity. How can they begin to start thinking about the equity implications of these systems and in terms of its impact on citizens, its impact on the quality of services that they deliver to citizens, and the degree to which these systems continue to perpetuate some of the disparate racial outcomes that historically have been the case. And so we think there's a lot of issues around just how public sector institutions, governments are using these systems, and how do we begin to put in place mechanisms that make them more accountable, but also make them more appreciative and more capable of understanding, right, what's at stake as they consider using these systems in their operations.
All right. So we have one more question. What techniques, when you present information to humans to change their views, are you finding effective? How do you present findings? I imagine particularly in the, when you're dealing with the public sector in terms of, police, if you're dealing with people, in the company or in an environment where they're not familiar with the technology, for instance.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's in some ways, right, it's one of the central questions, and it's something that we've been thinking a lot about in our work. It's interesting, right? I mean, what you just noted and what I think is implied in the question is that we've seen adoption of these systems with no real understanding of the prospects for these kinds of biases, and I think that has generated a lot of concern here and elsewhere in the world. But the reality is, right, is that we're all learning, and we're all beginning to develop, right, a better understanding of these systems as they become more widely diffused throughout society and throughout culture. And so, I think we as a society are beginning to articulate or, asking questions that just 5 or 10 years ago that we would not have asked, about technology, about its, impact on society. And so I think as a result of that, right, it makes it a little bit easier to facilitate conversations with leaders, with officials, with decision makers, who have some authority over the adoption and deployment of these systems, that because there's a growing kind of awareness, in some ways, right, a growing kind of reckoning of these systems and what's at stake, it's at least sort of opening up that window of opportunity to have these conversations with them in a way that just a few short years ago would have seemed, incredibly difficult to do. And so that's where I think we are now. My hope, right, is that that window of opportunity becomes wider and wider and wider. And that's, any organization, any institution, that's using these systems will almost sort of automatically, right, sort of ask questions about, well, how was this model trained and what kind of data was it trained on? And was that data audited for bias, or how do we put in place, right, a system to sort of continually monitor what the outputs or the decisions that the system is making? And if we detect bias or if we detect disparate impacts, what kind of mechanisms can we put in place to try to mitigate, reduce, or to reverse, right, those outcomes? And my hope as we grow our ability to sort of comprehend and understand these issues, that those will become more commonplace questions. And that if those become commonplace questions, it will compel those who are developing these systems to think about those issues beforehand, right? And so if I know that if I try to, sell my product, right, to a government or to a department or to an organization or to an industry, they're going to ask me, right, have I audited, my data set? Have I monitored, right, the performance of this system and the degree to which it may lead to biased outcomes? And if I anticipate, right, that those are going to be questions and that those are going to be considerations or criteria that might determine whether or not they like to use my system, I'm much more likely to address those things on the front end as opposed to the back end. And that's, I think, the direction, hopefully, that we're moving in and can sustain that here and certainly across the world.
All right, good, thank you. I actually have a question. Building on that is the issue of transparency. You mentioned it in the case of being denied a loan, for instance, and you want to know, why. In a lot of cases, I think the users of these algorithms or these programs can't really explain why the system did. I mean, making that information transparent might be even impossible for the actual, the bank who bought the system. But it also means that even if they could, I mean, what would make it transparent, right? Just a data dump would not actually help this person explain why, understand why they've been denied. But there's also, on top of that, kind of the epistemic issues, there's proprietary issues, right? So we've been at our university have software, for instance, for assessing student sort of outcomes. And the company that sold us that software would not, they gave us certain metrics that they use, but they would not reveal all of the metrics that they were using because, of course, they're sort of keeping their product, secret in a way from other companies that are doing similar things. So can you speak to those two issues, both the epistemic barriers and then maybe the proprietary or business side of it?
Yeah, and the proprietary claim, right, is certainly a frequent one, and to some degree understandable, right? And so, that's sort of we talked earlier, right, about how these issues are now kind of cross-cutting across different disciplines. So that in some ways, right, becomes a legal, question, maybe a philosophical one as well as other types of questions too. And so, to what extent, right, if I've developed this proprietary algorithm, I obviously don't want to reveal, right, what I've created because, it's a trade secret, right, or it's the value that that I have in terms of what I've created and what it potentially, how it potentially benefits me. So that is an issue. And the question then becomes, right, where is there opportunity for transparency without undermining, right, the proprietary nature of these systems? There's also the question, right, of to what extent, let's say, for example, in the criminal justice system or in public sector, you know, is that sufficient enough in and of itself? In other words, you know, should a criminal justice system, should a court, you know, be using a proprietary algorithm where it could never have access, right, to the sort of technical mechanism by which decisions are being made about whether or not someone, you know, can be released to go back out into society or not. So there's also this question, right, of just because we can use these systems, when should we not use these systems, right? And sort of understanding, you know, just because we can, you know, when are certain conditions or contexts appropriate, when are certain conditions and contexts inappropriate. And it simply may be inappropriate, right, to use a proprietary algorithm, right, in certain contexts. And that's a conversation that, you know, that we are having and will certainly, you know, continue to have. And then your earlier question, right, or the initial question, you're quite right. And what's particularly striking, right, about the emergence and the sort of flourishing, if you will, of machine learning is that these systems are engineered in ways, right, where they basically, right, are sort of teaching themselves, right, and so which suggests, right, that even the engineers, right, even the developers of these systems can't fully explain, right, how the system is making decisions, right? What's the sort of computational sort of modeling process through which it's going? And it sort of speaks, right, just to the complexity of these systems, the way they function and the way that they operate. And so in that regard, right, you know, you're quite right that even those who are developing these systems can't always fully explain or understand, you know, how decisions are being made. And again, right, I think that raises, right, a critical question is that if that's the case, right, you know, when should we be using such a system and when should we not be using such a system? And I think those are questions that we are going to, you know, continue to grapple with. They're going to play themselves out in the court of public opinion. They're going to play themselves out in the legal courts. They're going to play themselves out in philosophical and political debates about these issues. I mean, the reality is, right, that a lot of this, we are literally, right, at just the beginning stages, the origins of all of this. We know that AI has been a concept that goes, you know, decades back. And these systems and these models and these frameworks have been decades in the making. But in terms of actual real world application and in terms of adoption in these different sort of critical domains, you know, these are all relatively recent developments. And so these are conversations that we're just beginning to have and will continue to have. And so it'll be interesting to see, you know, how these conversations unfold. But I think, you know, the work that you're seeing here, the work that I've mentioned, work that we're trying to do, work that others are certainly trying to do, will hopefully advance our ability to better address those questions in a much more effective, meaningful, and satisfactory way.
Yes, thank you. Here's another question. What challenges have you seen on the data gathering and when facing communities with low or no technology access? How much does the data for these systems depend on the population's average use of the internet or social platforms, for instance?
Yeah, you know, depending upon the system, almost exclusively they're relying on, you know, humans generating, you know, all of this data. I mean, if you think about it, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, they have built, right, their massive wealth on data, right? These are, I mean, we debate, you know, what's Facebook? Is it a media company? Is it a technology company? Is it a social platform? You know, what is it? I mean, at its core, right, it is a data-based, data-driven system. And so it literally, right, its business model is predicated on the ability to sort of generate massive amounts of human and behavioral data. And then they've, the sort of achievement, right, is the degree to which they've been able to effectively monetize all of that behavioral, social, and human data in incredible ways that have led to, unprecedented forms of wealth. And this is certainly the case with most of these big tech companies. So you could argue, right, that their wealth is almost exclusively based on the data that we generate as a result of using these systems. And so, it's often been said, right, that in the case of social media, for example, if it's Facebook, you don't pay to use Facebook financially. You don't pay to use Google, services financially. And it's been said, right, that if you aren't paying for the product, then you are the product, right? And so you're the product by virtue of just the sort of behavioral and human and social data that we generate as a result of adopting and using these systems. And so, which is why we're seeing a greater call for data rights, a greater call for humans being able to have some degree or some modicum of control over how these technology companies use the data that we generate by virtue of using their platforms. And I think these are issues that are beginning to play out in the legal arena. They're certainly playing out in the philosophical and political arena as well. Will we see regulation, right, that gives citizens greater control over their data? We're seeing, companies at least trying to suggest that they're willing or moving towards giving people greater ability to control, manipulate, or understand, like the algorithms, and the algorithmic process. Now, they aren't giving up the proprietary nature of their algorithms, but to what extent, right, can they design their platforms in a way that allow us to hack or kind of manipulate the algorithm in ways that perhaps we explicitly, have not been able to. So these are all questions right around data rights, around the datafication of human life, behavior, and society. And so these are certainly critical questions moving forward.
Okay, I think we're just about run out of time. So let's thank again, Dr. Watkins, for joining us this afternoon. It was great. Thank you all for joining us as well. This is the last talk in our series, but we'll be back next September with a whole new series for next academic year. Thanks again, Dr. Watkins. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.